Hi, I'm Tom Stevenson, and welcome to Lecture 2 of our APS 1004 Human Resource Management for Engineering. You'll notice at the top of the screen it says Lecture 2A and 2B. That's because I'm going to break this up into two videos. That way you don't have to sit and watch one long one. At least they'll be a little bit shorter that way. So lecture 2A is what we'll start out with, and that's going to really look at goals, systems, strategy and tactics, habits, tools, and culture. And then part B, we'll look at human resource framework. So that'll be on a separate video that you can watch under lecture 2B. Even though it's one line, human resource framework, it actually will take quite a bit of time. That's going to be how we look at putting into something that we can recognize, a framework or lattice work that we can sort of move certain aspects of things that we talk about in our human resource management course into that framework. Sometimes it's easier to remember it or understand it if you have it in a framework. It's not that the framework is the be all to end all of everything. It's just a easier way to communicate and understand things and start thinking about how things interconnect with each other. I find that's helpful whenever we're talking about these types of subjects. So in lecture 1, and if you haven't seen lecture 1, you can go back and take a look at it. We talked about mission, the purpose of a company quite extensively, and hopefully by now we might have discussed it in the synchronous class. If not, and you're watching videos ahead, that's fine. Vision. So really, where's the company wanting to go? Where is it seeing itself in 3 years, 5 years, more longer term? Strategy in the business cycle. We started to talk about strategy. I want to today talk a little bit about strategy and tactics and how that kind of fits in. You're sort of seeing things at different levels, high level, the vision where we want to go, and then below that you have certain goals that the company or the corporation wants to try to achieve, and then below that is a bunch of different tactics to accomplish those particular strategies. So we've got goals and strategies, tactics, and we'll get into that. And they get finer and finer and more granular as you get more and more down into the weeds, so to speak, or into the lawn or grass. Every lecture I'm going to try to have a few different people that are fairly widely known or have done a lot of research in the area of business management, human resource management, success in those areas, motivational theories, economic theories that usually have impacts on how people respond to what's going on in their environment. And in class 1, we brought up Peter Drucker, the abbreviation. There's always a lot of abbreviations that we need to get a little bit comfortable with. He brought up what we call MBO, management by objectives. And objectives are just like goals. And how do we monitor that and how do we manage that process? And his big thing is if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And in the last class, we talked about SMART goals, and the M in SMART is measurable, right? So that really fits with the overall MBO philosophy. And we also mentioned Jim Collins, who comes up several times during the course. Get the right people on the bus. And so we spent a lot of time talking about mission and vision, and sort of, it doesn't really sort of come from high up above and this CEO has this mission and vision, although it does happen where the CEO does that. Jim Collins found that the most successful companies really are ones where they've spent a lot of time and effort making sure they have the right people, they've hired the right people, and that they're successful in the fact that their people are able to help design the mission, the vision, and execute on those particular goals that they've set out. It's much easier to keep people that are already motivated than it is to motivate people that it's not really their thing, this isn't really their interest, it's a paycheck. which we'll talk about later in the course as well. It's a paycheck. This is what I do, and they're going through the motions. You really want people that are engaged, and you want to do things in your business and as a manager and as somebody who works within the business to be as engaging as possible, because that makes the difference between a mediocre business and a great business, a good business and a great business, or a lousy business and a great business for that matter. And the more you're able to encapsulate that, of course, nobody's able to be 100% thorough with it, but the more you're able to encapsulate that, the more likely you are to reach for the stars, so to speak, as a business goes. And one of the things that I wanted to mention was not all well-intended goals are good. Just because you may, and I think I probably brought it up in the last session, is that, sometimes they have, people will work very hard to achieve them because maybe there's some sort of reward for having achieved them, whether that's some sort of extrinsic reward, monetary gain, bonuses, incentives, so to speak. But it may have some unintended consequences. So as a result of achieving that goal, we made a lot of profit short term, but long term, it's not the best thing for the business. Or yes, we I think I'd probably use the example of a home builder closing a lot of houses on time. And if they close all these houses on time, that's great for them. They've compressed the schedule. They can redirect that money, use it in building the next houses, improve their profit margins, etc. But if they have so many quality control issues that they have to go back and fix a lot of things, whatever profit they made, that might not be beneficial. The other thing is they might have a lot of dissatisfied purchasers who kind of spread the word, and that affects the brand negatively. That's not a good thing as well. So, if you have like an all intense focused profit goal, then at the expense of other things, that can be negative overall in the long term. So you got to be careful that your goals are well intended, but they're well thought through, and what I would call not just looking at first order consequences to what you're achieving, but also looking at second and third order consequences. So first order is I do this, this happens, but sometimes we stop there and we don't look at what happens after that, and that can be problematic. During the pandemic, if you were a store and you were seen to be gouging customers, well, you know what? Everybody wanted hand sanitizer. Everybody wanted masks at the same time. Everybody wanted toilet paper at the same time. Well, some of the bigger brand shopping stores, if they were seen to be gouging, you know what? Short term, they made some good profit, right? But long term, people remember. It gets in the newspapers. It gets highly publicized. You might have the premier, as was the case in this example, announcing how this company did this and this is not right and there will be punitive action. Just that is going to negatively impact the brand. So you have to be very, very careful about, just having tunnel vision on the goal without looking at second order and third order consequences and fourth order consequences. This happens, this happens, this happens. That can be very helpful, sort of using that as a tool when you develop these mental models that you're pushing yourself to achieve goals. And I'm not saying that goals aren't good. Goals are very good. You just have to be careful about the unintended consequences. Think it through. When we talk about project management, I've got this slide up here, which is really kind of project management based, but it's also business management based as well. Whenever we want to do something, there is what we call constraints. And if you've done, very often I have students that are doing the PMP, Project Management Professional. They're in the area of project management, particularly engineering students and management students. That happens very, very frequently. So when we think about project management, we have constraints. So PMP, Project Management Professional, PMI, Project Management Institute, they break this down. And pretty much any kind of project management, planning and scheduling type book, I've written textbooks in this particular area, will discuss the constraints: time, cost, quality, how they interact together, and how that fits in with scope. And they'll usually discuss them as constraints. If you're talking about construction, you could add safety, or even in manufacturing, you could add safety, or in other related areas. So when we talk about that, there's an interaction that goes on there. So they're constraints. We're working within these constraints. But I also like to flip it around, and I think it's very helpful to flip it around, that it's a constraint, but we can also flip it around and say it's a goal. It's a constraint. We're working under contract to fit this in this time. It's a goal. We want to meet or beat this time. It's a constraint. This is what money we have available for this. It's a goal. This is the money we have. Can we meet or beat this use of this particular cost in achieving our goal? We have this quality expectation of what we're supposed to provide. Can we meet this, or can we exceed this in any way, shape, or form? And what is it we're supposed to obtain? So these are all constraints, but they can also be just as easily flipped around and made into goals that you're trying to achieve. So think about that the next time you're managing a project, and think about that there is this relationship that goes on. So think about, you got a client that maybe wants to open a retail store before the holidays. We'll talk Christmas holidays in this case, shortening the schedule by 2 months. How would that affect, potentially affect quality and time? All right, so how could that affect quality and time? Well, if you shorten the time, typically quality will go down. So if you shorten the time that's available, typically quality will go down. If we look at the next one, we got the relationship. In this particular case, we're comparing the relationship before the holidays, and they're adding a series of changes to it. So when you add changes to the project, how does that affect scope? How does that affect cost? Well, you're adding changes, and when you're adding stuff, which is scope, that's going to increase your cost. So its cost is going to go up to a certain extent. And the one that's probably my favorite is the one where you're shortening the schedule by 2 months, and you're wondering how does that time and cost go together. So when you're shortening the schedule by 2 months, well, that means that costs are typically going to go up because you're going to be working weekends, you're going to be paying overtime, you might have more people in one spot, so you'll have a stacking of people, and people aren't always the most efficient when it's crowded and they can't really do their own work that well. And there are limits, as you'll see. So essentially this will shorten, but with this particular one, it'll only shorten up to a certain extent until it reaches what you call the impossible, or what we call the impossible zone. Also, when we shorten things and it adds to costs, and you think about your human resources, you're working weekends, you're working evenings. Are you at your best when you've been working 12-hour days, 7 days a week? There's a lot of statistical data that shows how much your productivity goes down once you go over a certain amount of hours. And that doesn't take that much above 40 hours on a longer term basis for you to really lose productivity. You start to get burnout and withdrawal. Sometimes it can hurt your family relationships. It can do a whole bunch of things. Also, we hit what we call the impossible zone. So there's a certain spot where it doesn't matter anymore how much people or how much more we work on this. We can't really shorten things by anything more. We've already got too many people on site. It's causing safety concerns. People are tired. We can't do certain activities because other activities aren't done. So there are definite limits to this one, and that's what we call the impossible zone in that. So goals, sometimes it's good to know where you are in a specific process. It's good to have the goals at a high level, broken down into a strategy, a path of how we're going to get there, and then getting tactics of how we will actually execute on the various activities. But you will see that at some point, if the time is too constrained, you can't accomplish it, no matter how much money that you want to put towards it. So there's this old saying. I wouldn't say that it's always exactly true, but there is a certain truthfulness in it. Time, cost, quality, pick any two, but you can't have all three without impacting at least one of the others. To a certain extent, that does hold true. So keep that in mind. The fifth constraint I mentioned was safety. And again, you can see how these interact with the other ones. I think, and usually when I have an engineering class, I usually have certain people that are in the aviation sector. So they always make good comments. So whatever comments when we do this synchronous will be quite helpful. So if this has happened in a sector that you're in, or a sector where it's of extreme importance, and you have any examples that you want to bring to the rest of the group, it always makes for some fruitful discussions. This is kind of the Boeing Dreamliner plant, the 737 issues that have occurred, how that affects the industry. And then there's, of course, this was in the New York Times fairly recently, New York Times review of hundreds of pages of internal emails, corporate documents, and federal records, as well as interviews with more than a dozen current and former employees, reveals a culture of often valued production speed over quality. And quality then ties into safety when we're talking about the aviation sectors. Facing long manufacturing delays, Boeing pushed its workforce to quickly turn out Dreamliners, at times ignoring issues raised by employees. So again, these things can sometimes come back to haunt a business if they start pushing for something and they have certain goals. And obviously a goal would be time oriented, to have these planes out in a specific time. That could potentially lead to problems in other areas. So that's sort of the interconnectedness that we can see between corporate goals and vision of what you're seeing and some of the unintended consequences. I'm quite sure it wasn't an intended consequence, but whether you like it or not, if you're pushing things too much, then that's the potential. Again, I'm not saying necessarily Boeing's at fault with this, but these are some of the things that come out as a result when these kind of tragedies occur. You can look at businesses that you're in, and you can often see how that affects the culture and the way that people make decisions. I think last class we talked about, the decision-making process and what are the policies. And if you know what your superior's sort of main driver is, that can actually affect how you make decisions in that process. So it can have that in that play that you're thinking about. So bringing back Jim Collins here, he also in Good to Great discussed what he called the most successful companies usually had a big, hairy, audacious goal. So it usually was a very big stretch goal that it's not a sure thing, right? So if you're really pushing for a goal, then usually if it's a sure thing, it's too easy. So usually it's got to be a stretch. So he sort of defined that as something that would have a 50 to 75% chance of success. You don't want to have a big, hairy, audacious goal, something that has like a 5% chance of success, because if it's perceived that way, then it's going to be a demotivator instead of a motivator, because here you're pushing on something that people feel 95% is not going to make it. Doesn't mean that something that some people think aren't going to make it couldn't be put into a big, hairy, audacious goal and then pushed towards that. And, I don't know at what point this video will be looked at, and I may reuse it in different semesters, but right now we're kind of in the heat of a pandemic. And from the very beginning, a lot of the experts in the areas, they were saying, this was in probably around March, they were saying that it would take, at least 4 or 5 years to get a vaccine. And I turned to my wife and I said, it's not going to take 4 or 5 years to get a vaccine. I actually even wrote it down in my journal. Let's see, it's back here somewhere. When I feel that they were going to have a vaccine. And I thought by early 2021, they would have a vaccine. It's not that time yet. I don't know if they're going to have a vaccine by that time. But I felt that if you look at how you could change the schedule around, and obviously a big priority is time on this, but it's also complicated because another big priority is safety. So you got two things, time and safety. And I just did the Dreamliner one. You got to be really careful about that. You get a vaccine that makes people sick or worse in large numbers, then it's sort of like, why did we do this? Because it's the the cure is worse than the cost. So safety is a big issue, but time's a big issue. But you know what? Cost, I don't think, is such a big issue. Like, there's a lot of money that's going into this. That you look at previous vaccines were 4 to 5 years in development or more, but there was limited money that was going towards it. You know, spending billions on this vaccine is a small amount when we're losing trillions. When you look at the economic downfall, and you look at the loss of life and other aspects that it's impacting. So it'd be very interesting to see how this plays out. Maybe I'll look at this video after a few years and sort of look back at it and see that my predictions were wrong, or they were incorrect, or that it was surprising that they were able to actually bring it into fruition so quickly. So 50 to 75% chance of success. I think if you were kind of old school looking at that at the time, you might be thinking that's impossible. But I think if you were actually looking at the money and looking at how projects get managed and how you can bring out the best of people and organize it in certain ways, then that becomes a big, hairy, audacious goal to get that out, a safe vaccine in the shortest period of time possible. So just putting that out there because it's current events, and it kind of makes a lot of sense that way to start thinking about those things. But you can make observations on that in a lot of things that you see out in your environment, and think about those things in your own life as well. Something that you might see as a big, hairy, audacious goal for yourself, where you see yourself in 5 years and what you see yourself being able to do. And then that's high level. And then, you know, this is a vision for yourself, and how do I break this down into further and further steps. So start thinking along those terms, because most businesses that are really successful, they think in those terms. Speaking of which, that brings up systems thinking. And systems thinking is, in some ways, can be different than goals. And I've seen people that sort of make the argument that, you know, goals are, Scott Adams, who I actually like. I think I've got a Dilbert cartoon in one of the slides coming up in a little bit, or in the second section. He writes Dilbert cartoons, and they're kind of this funny business cartoon if you read the business sections of most newspapers. And he's written several books, actually, and they're kind of interesting reads. He thinks a little differently on things, and I think his quote is, "Goals are for losers, and systems is really, you know, being able to repeat things with a system is for winners." And you know, he's got some truth in the way he says it. I think he sort of sensationalizes it a little bit to get more attention, but systems thinking really is important, and he's right on that. And goals thinking, as I described, if you're only thinking about goals, there can be problems in that. What I like to think about goals and systems is, though, they work together. I don't think one goes without the other. You have goals, this is what you want to achieve, but what I want to do is have systems in place so I can repeat my opportunities to be successful. I want to be able to have the systems in place that I don't have to think about every little thing, because I have a system in place, and that allows me and my people to focus on the hard stuff. The hard stuff is the stuff that needs knowledgeable people working collaboratively to solve, to be successful. Systems thinking allows us to simplify things and do them in a repetitive process so that we can repeat success and we can focus on the complexity of issues that surround us. So systems thinking is a way of looking at things and then breaking it down into a process that is repeatable. Systems thinking, it's why the most successful people, very often, they have systems or routines. And if you want to put it in a personal way of thinking about it, systems usually breaks down into routines, habits, rituals that individuals do, systems companies do, right? So, you know, somebody that's in very good shape, you know, not overweight, physically capable of doing things, they probably have a system or a series of habits that they do to make sure that they stay that way. And that usually involves something like maybe every morning they get up and they go to the gym, or they get up and they go for a long walk, and then they do a bunch of exercises, push-ups, what have you, that they ensure that on a daily basis they get that done. That is systems thinking. So when they wake up, they don't even think about it. They just go into that routine. It's not hard. It's not taking a lot of willpower. It's not taking a lot of expertise, because it's been developed over time, and it's just a process that is followed. Well, companies can do the same thing, and that's systems thinking in how they would implement a project. Having processes and procedures in place can help that. You just have to be a little bit careful with it. If it's overdone, that could also mean that you have so many processes and policies and procedures in place that it kind of stifles people, and it stops them from being creative and innovative. So everything has its boxes and frameworks that it fits within, but if it's overdone or overutilized, it can actually work in the negative. So just like goals could be, if they haven't been well thought through for second and third order consequences, systems that are overdone may just make creative people stop being creative, or they may want to leave the company, and that leaves a void in the company, so it's not as innovative as it was, and they keep doing the same thing over and over again, and then somebody else surpasses them. But systems thinking, when done well, is extremely valuable and extremely profitable. We'll talk later in the course about Fordism and Taylorism, and you'll start to see how that fits in the process, and then where the weaknesses are and how you have to tweak some of those weaknesses to get the full benefit, because we are dealing with humans too, so we have to be conscious of that. So goals versus systems. So in my opinion, they are not mutually exclusive. I got to have a goal that I want to build this building in this time frame with this amount of money. I got to have a goal that we're going to put out this product line, or we're going to put out this aircraft, or this car, or this system that's been manufactured. And so there is the goal, right? And then we talked about the things that surround that: time, cost, quality, scope, safety, what have you, depending on the type of goal it is. Why would you not build systems into the process? The first time, the systems might be crude and rudimentary, but it's an evolving process. So you want to make sure that then they're continuously improving, adjusting, until you have a very, very productive, viable system, and that you don't forget that change is inevitable and occurring, and you don't stifle the creativity side of the business. So for all those reasons, this is where goals and systems work together. And in business, systems work similarly, get people to work in routines and habits, as I was mentioning. Routines, habits, rituals, very, very important for personal success, very, very important for business success. A lot of businesses, they deal with clients that might be national clients or global clients, business to business type contracts. And those clients expect a certain amount of uniformity in their dealings. So they don't expect ad hoc something different with each experience. So it also it makes the mundane work easier and more efficient, which allows you to have more focus on what you're trying to accomplish. Provides important data that can be mined for continuous improvement, because you've got a system in place. You can be gathering data, and then you can mine that information for improvements and reflection and new iterations of how you're going to move forward with projects and operations. So the best systems make work more efficient and easier for employees. Systems should not be making things more difficult. Systems should not be handcuffing an employee from making the right decision, so that they just make the wrong decision because this is the system that is in place. So there has to be enough controls in place to protect the business, but at the same time, enough autonomy given to the employees that they can make correct decisions when it's right. So I find students very often ask me strategy versus tactics. They hear about strategy and they don't fully understand what's the difference. So I've got this quote here from Sun Tzu. Uh, Wrote a book called The Art of War long time ago. And it's a very sort of famous book, been widely quoted. It's on really on war strategy and tactics, and a lot of people in the 20th and 21st century have been using it to describe business practices. Some elements of the art of war fit business tactics. And I think you could probably, there's no copyright on that book. That book is written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, so it's not copyright. So I think there's probably a free online version if you ever want to read it. I think it's probably, I remember I read it, I usually read it in the airport sometimes. When I'm waiting for a plane, it takes about an hour, I think, to read the book. So it's not a long book, hour and a half. Easy read. But you can sort of see some elements that can be utilized. Usually when I refer to a book, there's no one book that's the be-all to end-all, but there's certain things and certain takeaways that fit into a lattice work of knowledge that you'll build over your careers, and then you'll find certain tools and techniques in there that can be helpful for you long term and help to build sort of the mental models, your approach to certain things when they come up, and how to resolve and solve them in a thoughtful and thorough way. So what Sun Tzu really means, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Well, then think about strategy. We have an overarching goal, and really strategy is the path to achieve that goal. So we've got an overarching goal, and we want to build this particular building, and we've got a design for this building. And so now we've got an overall pathway of how we're going to actually construct the building. The tactics is more the short-term execution of all the elements to fit along the path to achieve the overall strategy and meet the overall goals of constructing this building within a time frame, a budget, quality expectations, safety expectations. The tactics are the day-to-day things that we're doing, and how we're coordinating and collaborating with all the subcontractors and suppliers to actually construct this particular project. So tactics are a lot easier to change than the strategy, right? So, strategies are a higher level, and these are things, the components that we need to do, and this will get us on our path to doing it, and they might have major milestones, phase dates, and that sort of things. The tactics is more the short-term, day-to-day, week-to-week operations that we're doing, and we might get immediate feedback that something's not working, or something occurred, some bad weather event or something, and we got to pivot, we got to adjust, we got to be agile in those processes. So that's the tactics. And you can sort of see from a military background, the overall strategy is we want to take this hill, and this is sort of how we plan to do it. But tactics would probably mean that you might have to make a lot of adjustments because there's a lot of things that you didn't count on occurring in order to meet that overall target, goal, mission. So if you're wondering what's the difference, that's sort of spelling it out to you. So strategy is really tying into the higher level plans of how we're going to meet our overall goals, and the tactics are the everyday things that we're needing to do and adjust to meet the overall path and goals of the project, mission, whatever it may happen to be. So good sort of explanation between strategy versus tactics. And of course, Sun Tzu, tactics without strategy, it's kind of like we're building this building, but we really don't have the drawings finished, and we're building walls, and we're building it with 8-foot when the client really wants 10-foot high ceilings, and it's just going to be a mess, and it's going to be problematic. So from a art of war point of view, as Sun Tzu would say, without tactics, without strategy, you have no overarching plan and goal, is really the noise before defeat, because you really don't know what you're doing. Speaking of that, another sort of war hero that came out with sort of a matrix priority tool is Dwight D. Eisenhower. He actually was the leader of the U.S. forces in World War II, and there's what we call this matrix priority tool. He noticed it. I doubt that he actually developed it, but he's the one that's quoted with it the most often. So they call it the Eisenhower matrix, and it really has this matrix has these quadrants, and there's what Eisenhower termed urgent and not urgent, important and not important. This was also brought up again by a author, Stephen Covey. I think I've got it up here. Let's see. Yeah. He wrote this book here, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Very, very well researched book. Stephen Covey was a professor, I forget exactly, Utah, I forget which university right now, but very widely used book in the business sector. And so the 7 habits of highly effective people, one of the habits included this matrix, and really it's the aspect of managing your time. And we can argue about the nuances. Well, we can't really develop time, but what you could do is prioritize what you do with the time you have. So you can prioritize what you do with the time you have. And so if you look at this box, there's a lot there. There's a lot to think about with this box. I would encourage you to Google search this topic and do a little bit of background reading on this, because it is really kind of changes the way you think about things when you're managing projects, when you're managing people, and when you're managing your own life. So we can think about things that need to be done as being important and urgent. That means that we got to do it right away, and it's really important to get it done. Important and not urgent. That means we've got something that's really important. It's probably going to take a lot of time, but if we don't do something today, there's always tomorrow, right? It's like it's not got to be done right now. So important but not urgent. And then we have not important and urgent. So this is like needs to be done soon, but it's not really that important. So a lot of times if it never gets done, it's not a big deal. Sometimes I think of this one, not important and urgent, very often is somebody else needs something right away. Doesn't really impact you so much, but they need it. And so you might be compelled to do it for them because you want to keep the relationship, you want to make them happy. But very often it's their own procrastination that is impacting you. You know, as a professor, I get that all the time. Students, they're late with an assignment, or they want me to do something past the due date, and to them it's like, well, why won't this individual mark it? What's the difference whether it's 2 weeks later or it was handed in on time? Well, the difference for me is if it's handed in on time, I have all the assignments lined up and I mark them one after the other, and then I get into a rhythm, and it's very easy and a flow of work, and it gets through. 2 weeks later, I got to find the file, and what was the answer sheet for this, and what's this, and what's that, and how was I marking it? And something that would have taken me 15 minutes to mark now ends up taking me 40 minutes to mark. So there is a difference. Urgent, not important. Understanding that how this fits in from your perspective is important from being able to prioritize your time. And then the last one, the yellow one there, is not important, not urgent. So it's not important and not urgent. This is spending your time maybe looking at Facebook. That's usually the big culprit that people like to quote, or looking at YouTube videos that you really don't learn much from, or cat videos and things like that. So not urgent, not important, that's another thing that if you're spending a lot of time in the yellow box, then you're probably not going to meet many of your life goals, right? You're going to be sort of 10 years later wondering what happened to the time frame. And so from the priority tool matrix, you can sort of identify, well, on what things takes up my time in each one of these boxes. And if we think about that from a positive, long-term, proactive process, then we'll recognize that probably the best area to be doing most of our work from is in the important, not urgent. Some things have to be done important. They come up and they're urgent, you know, depending on your field of work. There could be what we would call an unknown unknown, or a black swan event occur, and it takes a lot of your attention and you've got to respond to it in a very short period of time. So those things, they do happen. But often important and urgent is something that was important and not urgent, but you left it so long and you procrastinated so long that now it's become important and urgent. You know, your boss wanted you to do X, Y, Z and gave you a month to do it, and it probably would only take you 3 days to do. But now 2 days before it's due, you haven't even started it. So now that's become important and urgent, and everything else falls away, and that becomes that particular item. And usually when you're rushing, going back to the time, cost, quality, if time is really, really, really short and we're looking at time and quality and you're behind on it, usually quality suffers, the quality of the report or the quality of whatever it was that you were supposed to do. You might think that, oh, that's great, that's how I get the motivation to do things, but generally something is suffering in that process. Or everybody else that you're pushing that needs to do something all of a sudden, and you're putting them into what not important and urgent. It's urgent for you, but it's not important for them. That's putting unnecessary pressure on them. So not the best situation. So really, what you really want to do with this is you want to, over time, you want to look at, can I maximize this box and minimize these other boxes? You're not going to get rid of them, you know, but if this is watching, you know, 8 hours of TV a day, perhaps utilizing this, you minimize that to an hour of TV a day instead. If this is doing things for other people, that's great, but not at the expense of you being able to do your important and not urgent activities. All right? So not saying you don't, but you do say no to some things, particularly maybe there's some repeat offenders that are just constantly making their problem your problem. You have to be able to communicate that there's limitations on these items. So from a planning tool, prioritization of what work needs to be done, you want to look at it from this perspective. If you're managing people too, the more that you can get your team and the people that you're working with in this zone and not in this sort of firefighting zone that we kind of mentioned at the beginning of the last class with the reactive side of things, the more proactive you are, which is really what this zone is all about, then the more likely you will be successful. I think a good example of important, not urgent, that I think about for myself that I've had to do is something like writing a textbook. So this is a textbook I wrote recently, and I've written other ones, but essentially this is a project management, planning, scheduling, control textbook, and it was with a US publisher. It took quite a while to put it together, but it was important, not urgent. But it doesn't get done unless you actually put a certain amount of time to it. So the initial draft for the book, I kind of start at a high level. Well, what's the vision? Well, I want to have this book, right? So I want to be an author. I want to write in this particular area. So you're kind of attuned to that. You get an opportunity, you get a contract signed, and then you start thinking, well, so my overall goal is to have this done in a particular time frame. So you look at it, well, this is my book that I have to do, and I've got a year to do the draft. So I've got a year to do the draft. Okay, well, if I have 12 chapters, that's pretty easy then. 1 month per chapter. So you break that down into 1 month per chapter. Then you want to break it down further into, well, what am I going to have to do weekly to get a chapter done a month. And so you break that down. And then maybe that gets down into, well, what do I got to do daily to get this thing where I need to meet my weekly target? So I want to have a rough area done and figure it out in the first week. What do I have to do? And so that's getting into some daily practices. So I'm going to commit to an hour every day of writing towards this book. So now when you're getting down into that 1 hour per day, and you're getting down into what I got to do this week, you're getting into the tactics, and then that's building routines, habits, systems, so that it makes it easier for you to do. And once you get into those routines, habits, systems, then it flows into meeting and reaching an overall goal, like having the draft finished in a year. Some of the things with the editors and things like that, they get outside your control because they're with the publisher. But what's inside your control, what can you do? And that would be fitting in the important and not urgent. If I didn't do that, then this would be coming up into important and urgent. I'd be scrambling and trying to put this thing together, and it would be not very good. And the end result would not be very good. And who knows, the publisher might drop you and say, well, nice try. So you can kind of think of things in those terms and how that goes together from that process. So I think this is a good area to stop this video, and we'll go into the part 2. I'll take a short break myself, and we'll go into part 2 on a separate video, which will be the framework for the aspect of human resource management. We will be discussing this in the synchronous portion. I want you to start thinking about goals that you have, and goals that you want to achieve, and goals that you've met in the past, and what are some of those successful elements. And we'll discuss that in our actual synchronous classes. So Tom Stevenson for now, signing out, and have a wonderful day, and we'll get to lecture 2B shortly. Bye for now.